Move us down there, and then I'll present. Okay, so we should all be on this one. All right. So I thought it was important to have a conversation about what's the difference. Oftentimes, reproductive rights, health, and justice are kind of used interchangeably, but they are distinctly different things. And I thought it would be useful for us to have a conversation, talk a little bit about what each of those things are and how we can navigate advocating for reproductive health and reproductive rights and being part of reproductive justice. I think it's important to note where interfaith lands in all of this. The reality, I think reproductive justice is one of the issues that most easily aligns with all of Interfaith Alliance of Colorado's values, recognizing that oftentimes religion is used as a barrier for people accessing care. There is definitely a racial disparity in who gets access to care and who doesn't. And that doesn't just create economic justice issues, but if individuals are already dealing with economic barriers, then adding on top of that access to their reproductive care is another barrier, another part for them to have to overcome. I like this breakdown. So health is the service delivery. That's what we're talking about. What are the actual services that someone's receiving? Rights are all the legal issues. So what are the barriers, the policies that are in place? And then justice is the movement. How are we all being involved in the movement of reproductive health and rights? Even though they're all distinct, they all have to work together. That's the only way we're going to have a solution, is if all the pieces are working together. So reproductive health, I like this breakdown. It comes from the World Health Organization. For health is looking at service delivery, and it addresses the reproductive processes, functions, and systems at all stages of life. So we're not just talking about someone who is at the age where they can reproduce, but what does that service delivery look like earlier in life as well? So it implies that people are able to have a responsible, satisfying, and safe sex life, and that they have the capacity to reproduce and the freedom to decide if, when, and how often to do so. So something that I think about with that umbrella of reproductive health as service delivery, where a young person would have access to care and whether or not they have the capacity to reproduce can be based off of if they're born intersex and surgeries are performed. That might interfere with their access to reproduce, but we wouldn't necessarily generally think of a baby or a young child when we're talking about reproductive health. But they are part of that conversation, even if they are little, because the decisions that we're making are deciding whether or not they can or can't reproduce later in life. All right, I like this question, and I know it's just a couple of us, but I think it's important to think about with service delivery, one of the parts is my access to information. That is part of service delivery, is what information I obtained. So part of that is, did I obtain it before I needed it? Did I obtain it when I needed it? Or did I obtain it after I needed it? So thinking about that, I'll give you all a minute to just think through that. But what I want to think about is if I'm providing service to someone, for instance, I'm teaching someone or someone's coming in for a pap smear. Are they going to learn about what the process of a pap smear is before they even come to the appointment? When they're at the appointment or after the appointment? Are they going to go online and try and figure out all the pieces of it? So that's where that service delivery connects to information. And when we learn what takes place during an appointment, what is considered standard care? That's information that you might gain from your family, you might gain it from a doctor, and that's probably occurring when you need it rather than before you need it. Or you might have access to some of that information in your sex education programs. So, Tamara, did you have the opportunity to get the information before you needed it, when you needed it, or after you needed it?
I would say when I think about, I guess I'm thinking about giving birth and having children. Is that an all right
Yeah,
point to be making a connection here?
yeah, wherever you.
Yeah, like I definitely was not informed. Like I really did not know what was happening until it was happening. in
Mhm.
almost my whole experience. And I tried to do the sort of natural childbirth classes, which gave me all sorts of great information for how things would be if a person was so fortunate as to have a natural childbirth experience. That was not my experience. And so therefore I had like, blinders for this one way of how my birth was going to be. And I had some information about that process, but honestly not great. And then when things were not part of that, I was in like, I might as well have been, whatever, getting like, some sort of super complicated neurosurgery for as much as I knew about what was happening. So I did,
Right.
yeah, definitely. Definitely during and after. Then afterwards, I was like, what was that?
Right. And that's a place where ultimately you can't really advocate for yourself if you don't have a lot of information
Mhm.
on what can I advocate? Where are my choices in how I'm receiving care? And pregnancy is a big one where it can go a lot of different ways. So there's a lot of pieces of that information from the very beginning piece of just, am I going to have natural or not? Where am I going to deliver? And what are the different rules at those facilities to actually once you're in labor and that laboring process?
Mhm.
And you can talk about that, Margaret, or you can talk about something else where you received healthcare, whether that be just access to information as a young person or later in life. And you're muted.
Something that comes to my mind because it left such an impression on me. Um, I was teaching school in Denver. This has been 50 years plus ago. And I went to a gynecologist that was not far from my apartment because I didn't have a vehicle. I could walk there.
Mhm.
Didn't know anything about, but it was just accessible to me to go to the gynecologist for the purpose I set for myself to get birth control. And when I got to the appointment, I had made a gynecology appointment. I'd never had an exam, and so that was the first step to make sure I was taking precautions. And the doctor informed me why I was asking for birth control. I said, "Well, I'm engaged. I have a wedding coming up, and I want to get birth control." And he again said, "Why?" Um, he was opposed to birth control, and of course that was back in the '60s. So clearly, uh, he had been practicing for a while and was Catholic, I found out, and was against birth control. And I was just appalled and very naive. And so I just left. But I had to pay the bill. And then I had to make another appointment and find a way to get there because I was a first year teacher just out of college and I didn't have a way to get there. Yeah, I had a much better experience when I had my children. I was living in Prince George's County, Maryland, living inside the Washington, D.C. Beltway.
Mhm.
I got excellent prenatal care and delivery and natural childbirth classes and all of that.
Right. It's so important that you bring that up because oftentimes you have to do a lot of research on your providers. And so it's not just information about the care that you're seeking, but who is this person that's going to be providing me care and what are their values? And can I find that information online? Or do I have to look a little bit deeper and go to all the reviews? And we're fortunate now to have the internet, which has some information about providers, but that implies that people who've already gone there had a good or a bad experience. And that doesn't tell you what your experience is going to be like.
This raises another, Margaret, that's a huge story, I think, because it raises that question of religious freedom, because that doctor was invoking his religious freedom to have an opinion about his own, you like, okay, doctor, if you don't want to use birth control, don't. But for him to be able to impose that belief on his patients is part of what's really dangerous when religious freedom gets woven into healthcare, because suddenly then we have to make, we have to do the research, or we have to we call 911 and the ambulance shows up and you're like, tell me about you before you even get in the ambulance, right? Like if you can't count on the system to treat people and give them the care that they're asking for and needing, then that's.
And he was very condescending.
Oh, God.
It was very much, how dare you? Why wouldn't you want children?
And to be clear, even though your experience was quite some time ago, doctors still do that. I know when I went to access birth control, I was told, these are your options. Because we are a Catholic facility, you don't have access to this option. So you would have to go see a new provider. And recognizing I'd been with my provider for some years at that point. So there are still those pieces where the facility that you're in has specific guidelines, or the individual within a facility, which is more difficult because you read about the facility and you're like, oh, okay, this is what I'm getting myself into. But then ultimately that provider can choose what they do or don't want to do as far as care is concerned. The other thing I wanted to bring up as we're talking about this information piece is who has access to information. So previously I was a special education teacher, and oftentimes those are kids who are left out of access to learning about their bodies. They don't learn the information often until after they need it, rarely before, and sometimes when. And we were doing this activity, we called it Thank You Thursdays. So the young people would write a thank you note to somebody, and they just finished their sexual health curriculum with their health teacher. And so they're sitting there writing out their notes. And one of the kids said, how do you spell ejaculation? And I was like, what are you writing in your note? What are we talking about here? And he was a sophomore in high school. And so he told me what he was writing. And he said, yeah, I never knew that like other people ejaculate. I never knew that happens to other people. And to recognize that this was likely something that had been happening to his body for a while, and he didn't know that this was something other people experience. He didn't understand why it happens. And he talked about how he wanted to thank the health teacher for explaining that to him, for explaining what wet dreams were, because he just thought something was wrong and he was scared. And that's the reality when people don't get information before they need it, but rather after, is the fear that sets in because you don't know. Something that we always encourage is that you're giving information at whatever the person's chronological age is. So regardless of what their developmental age may be, being mindful that their body is developing at its chronological age. So they need information at whatever their chronological age is. It was really important to us. So we were providing that information before they needed it. And now knowing that things change over time. The average age of someone having their period has gotten younger and younger. So before you might have had that conversation at 13, 14, and now we're encouraging people to have those conversations with 9 and 10-year-olds. So they're not surprised. The other part, like you brought up, Margaret, was the access to care piece. So what is it that people are learning about their bodies and how can they access care? So with that service delivery, we're looking at two pieces. Someone's information about their bodies and someone having access to care for themselves. That's under that reproductive health. So how is that impacted? Their ability. What is the facility that they're going to? So whether that ability be a physical barrier, whether that be an intellectual barrier, what their geographic location is. Are they in a part of town that's easy for them to get somewhere? Like you were saying, if you don't have access to a vehicle, what access do you have? Their age. Can they access care if they're a minor? Their sexuality and their gender impacts who is going to access care from. Also, the reality of your heritage and your history. We all hear stories passed down from our older family members about the care that they received. And that's going to change our notion of what we have access to. Employment likely is tied to your insurance. And then knowing that in reality, whether your religion is a piece of that, also can play a part in what you have access to, or a provider that understands how your faith impacts the care that you're receiving. So it doesn't necessarily mean that these are things that individually are going to be like, yes, I can go to a facility or I can't. But once you arrive there, How are people going to talk to you? How are people going to explain things to you? If it's going to be in a way that you can understand, whether that be a language barrier or otherwise. And I often talk about language, we think of English and Spanish and so on, but how are we making sure it's accessible developmentally language-wise? What about people who sign language is their primary way of interpreting? So how does that impact my access to language if there isn't an interpreter there? Or who understands all the health words? There's a shortage in male sign language interpreters, and thinking about what that means to go access care and someone explaining things to you. And naturally, this is a private moment between you and your provider. And so having another person there whose gender aligns with yours or whose orientation is aligns with yours can help you feel more comfortable in a space and can impact how you are interpreting that interaction and how you feel you can or can't access care. All right. So I think this is important when we were talking about earlier about information. So what is comprehensive sexual education? It's a word that's used a lot. So HIV and STI instruction. So I'm learning about the process of that. I'm learning about healthy relationships. Too often we focus on the physical interactions and we're not talking about what's healthy. What's consent look like? Do I learn about pregnancy? And the education must be age appropriate. It should be evidence-based, culturally appropriate, and medically accurate. And Colorado is above quite a few other states in that we can check all of these boxes. But that is not true for every state, that they require that the information they provide even be medically accurate. And that's something important. Go ahead.
Question, Sam.
Yeah.
Is that across the whole state of Colorado, every school district? Are they mandated to have this?
Yes, so they're mandated to offer it. Parents always have the option to opt out. And we're an opt-out state, not an opt-in state, which generally increases the likelihood that people follow through, is that they can say, nope, I don't want my young person having access to this information, or I want to educate them my own way. So this is just the checklist. Now, we also have to acknowledge you can have a great list, you can have a great curriculum, but there has to be a person implementing that curriculum who's comfortable having those conversations as well. And so that can be a barrier sometimes, but this is the standard that we're asking for. But go ahead, Tamara.
Yeah, the only thing to add to that is the way it's written from the law standpoint is if a school is going to do sex ed, they have to do comprehensive sex ed. So actually, there's a lot of schools that don't do it because they would rather do not comprehensive sex ed, and now they are not legally allowed to do like, sex ed that's poor. So that's good, but it also means that, some schools have then taken it entirely out of their curriculum, which is, obviously not ideal either, particularly across the more, the rural communities. The larger school districts have worked together to try and implement it, but in the smaller, more rural school districts, as Sam said, there's matters of who's going to teach it, funding, and then this factor that a lot of the people in those communities sometimes don't want their kids taught this way. So there's a lot of complexity to it, but we stand in the right place with our laws and our words for sure. Implementation is always the more complex part.
And recognizing, for me, I did a lot of education on working with parents to understand why they don't want to opt their young people out. And I think that's another piece of it. Oftentimes when parents have access to this is what the curriculum is going to entail, and they get a chance to ask some of those questions, it can calm some of their concerns and help them understand, okay, this is what my student's being taught versus what I'm thinking my student's being taught or what I was taught. So really encouraging that conversation. And that's the way when we're talking about service delivery, I have the information now. So I think this is an important part to look at. And what reproductive health, rights, and justice talks about a lot is that there's systematic oppression. And oppression is preventing us from having access to care, is preventing us from having all the legal rights we should. And so I think this is an important idea to think about, is how does that individual, like you were talking about, how is their belief system impacting the care that I'm receiving? How is the institution that they're operating within impacting the care that I'm receiving? And then the structural pieces. So the pieces that aren't necessarily there right away, where I think of them right away, but all of that is also impacting the care that I'm receiving. I point this out because one of the things I have found is when we're talking about interactions and policies and procedures and such, sometimes we focus on that institutional piece, which is important, but there are people within those institutions. And so people, we all know, some are really good rule followers and some aren't. So just because something's in the policy doesn't mean the individual people are going to be following that policy. And maybe some of it's conscious and some of it's unconscious. There's a research article, it just came out, but the research was in 2016, but the article just came out about the different myths that providers believed about their patients and how that then ultimately impacted the care that they received. Alrighty. So reproductive rights, that's what we're talking about. What are those legal pieces that are impacting the way that someone's getting care? So what are the ways that the laws and public and corporate policies, and are those based on racial, gender, or class prejudice? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about reproductive rights. It's the reality that it's a basic right that people should be able to decide how many children, if they want children, the number, the timing, the spacing, that they have the information to do that, and that there aren't laws interfering with their ability to make those choices. There's two pieces to that. So informed consent. So I understand what I am saying yes or what I am saying no to. That is the first part of this rights piece. And then protection from unnecessary procedures. So I am not going into the hospital for issue A, and they're saying, oh, well, we decided we're going to take care of it with this way, B. So there are no procedures that are unnecessary. And I would also say in small print, the flip side of that I'm being offered all the necessary procedures. So I'm not just being told about the things that they think I should choose, or being told about the things that they think I can afford, or all the rationale for why a provider might not tell me all of my options. But instead, I'm being given all the information so I can be informed and say, yes, this is what I want. With underneath reproductive rights is that it's a human right. So we have the human right to think about the safety and dignity of everyone. If you look, there's tons of great lists online of what are our rights. So I'm going to pick out a couple that I thought were important. To seek and receive information. So if I'm sitting with my provider and I'm saying, hey, I saw this commercial about PrEP, what is that? So I should be able to ask a question and my provider should answer my question with accurate information. It's about my dignity and my ability to say, these are the decisions I want to make about my own health, my body, my sexual life, my identity. All of those decisions are mine to make. And it's being free from discrimination, coercion, and violence. All of that are part of my rights. A doctor should be giving me all my information. I should not feel like coerced or pressured into making one decision over another. I should not be forced to carry a pregnancy to term or forced not to carry a pregnancy to term that I want to carry to term. And one of the things that have been throughout our history is forced sterilization. So the reality that some people are not given their informed consent, they're not given the right to decide what happens to their bodies. And they're being told that one thing is happening another, back to that informed consent, or they're not told anything. And then after the fact, they learn that they actually were sterilized. This was a practice that continues. It's not written into laws the same way it was, but it's still going on today. The other piece I think is important of why this reproductive justice framework and reproductive rights framework is different is the decision was made to look at reproductive rights and human rights, that all of these pieces are interconnected, that nothing stands alone. If I, in my environment, have toxins in the air then that's affecting my choice to reproduce. If I want to make decisions about my body and, let's say, remove my reproductive organs, then that impacts my gender identity. Disability justice is a big part of the conversation because oftentimes individuals who have disabilities aren't granted the rights that they deserve. And all of these pieces are part of it because each person comes into a facility and or doesn't come into a facility. If they're concerned about their immigration status, they may never come in. If they have a partner who's violent, they may never come in. And so addressing reproductive justice addresses all of these, and addressing all of these also address reproductive justice. Or pardon me, reproductive rights. I keep saying justice because they're all justice issues, but they're my rights as well. All right, so reproductive justice, that is our movement. So we are working towards building a movement that serves everyone. So there's a couple different ways, and if you come to one of my education sessions, you'd know there's a specific way that I describe reproductive justice, but I'm gonna back up a little bit, and I'm actually gonna use the definition that's used by the Asian communities for reproductive justice. And they say it's the human right to control our sexuality, our gender, our work, and our reproduction. So it's a little bit bigger than the definition I generally use, which I'll talk a little bit about still. So that's that. What are all the pieces, right? Do I have the complete physical, mental, spiritual, all of these well-beings to control? And control is important because oftentimes people are controlling other people's bodies rather than individuals having control over their own body, over their own sexuality, and their own decisions regarding how they reproduce or if they reproduce. So the definition I usually talk a lot about, or the breakdown I usually use, is those four pieces. So what's the core when we're talking about reproductive justice is that people have the right to have children, to not have children, and to nurture children we have in safe and healthy environments. So right to have children, that goes back to the sterilization piece, that I'm not being prevented from having children. The right to not have children, that have access to birth control or have access to abortion services. And what's the environment I raise my young people in? Was a news article I read the other day. It was so interesting talking about lead. Lead poisoning is something we've known about for decades now. We didn't know how serious it was, but as time's gone on, we now know how serious it is, and we're now doing testing for lead poisoning and thinking, am I able to raise my kid in a safe and healthy environment if where I'm raising them, there's lead in the paint, if there's lead in the water? All of that's part of not just being able to have a child, but be able to raise them in a safe and healthy environment. This is where oftentimes we connect that safe back to areas that are over-policed, areas that are under-resourced. All of that is contributing to my reproductive justice rights and whether or not ultimately I'll have reproductive health issues, because now I'm in this area that doesn't have healthy conditions to raise my child in. And then I have to access care outside of my neighborhood. And all of those layers of barriers start adding up more and more. The other part that's part of reproductive justice to note is that I have power. So one, I have the economics to make the decisions that I want to make. That money is no object when we know that those of means will always be able to access care. So how are we really navigating that? What's the social power that you have? What's the political power that you have? And what are the resources? Reproductive justice says you would have all of these things. So you have the economics to make the choice you want. You have the social, political power to make the choices that you want. And you have the resources for whatever choices that you make. When all of those are there, then you will have actual justice. So last thing, how are we achieving this reproductive justice? We're analyzing the power within systems. We're addressing those intersecting oppressions. We're going to center the most marginalized, and we're going to join together across issues and identities. That is how we can work towards reproductive justice and achieve it, because we're breaking down the systems that prevent it from occurring. And we're working together to ensure that not just one person is able to access care, but everybody is. And when you center the most marginalized, then everyone has more access to care across the board, over and over and over. That is the way to do it. I am going to stop sharing.